In the spring of 2015, the small town of Briarwood, Tennessee, was a place where the echoes of church bells seemed to mark the rhythm of everyday life. Nestled in the rolling hills of the South, it was a town where tradition and faith ruled, and the tight-knit community held the local church as the heart of its existence. The air always carried a sense of serenity, until the storm came. Father James Hunter stood tall, his eyes a mix of wisdom and quiet sorrow as he gazed at the stained glass windows of Briarwood Community Church. His life had been one of duty, an unbroken devotion to his faith, the Lord, and the people who depended on him. As a child, James had always felt the weight of expectation, the pull of his mother's voice as she gently guided him toward the path of righteousness. A man of God, she had said. A light in the darkness. But in the silence of his own heart, James carried a burden he couldn't share. The loneliness of his service had grown heavy, a quiet ache that gnawed at him during the long, solitary hours spent in prayer and reflection. It was on a stormy night in May when the calm of his world began to unravel. Father James had just finished his evening prayers when the knock on the door came, soft but urgent. He opened it to find a woman standing on the threshold, drenched from the rain. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She looked like someone lost, someone who had wandered too far into the darkness. "Father," the woman whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I need help. I'm lost." She stepped forward before he could speak, her presence unmistakable, yet unsettling. Evelyn Morris, he learned her name to be. A woman in her early 30s, with the kind of troubled past that James could see written in the lines of her face. She wasn't just a stranger to Briarwood, she was a ghost in its midst, someone who had lived through pain and betrayal, with a reputation that preceded her. Yet here she stood, at the door of his sanctuary, asking for salvation. "I don't know where else to go," she continued, her voice trembling. "There's something wrong. I've tried everything, but I can't find peace. I need your help, Father." James hesitated. He had heard the rumors about Evelyn, the whispers of possession, the claims of a tortured soul lost in the grip of dark forces. But his duty, his calling, had always been clear. Help those who are lost. Save those who are suffering. He had done it countless times before, offering solace, a safe haven in times of need. And so, with the compassion he had been taught to embody, James opened the door wider, inviting her in. "You're safe here, Evelyn," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Come inside. We'll pray together." Evelyn stepped over the threshold, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his stomach tighten. There was something unsettling in her gaze, something too knowing for a woman who claimed to be lost. But James pushed the thought aside, focused instead on his responsibility to her. As they sat together, Evelyn recounted her story, a tale of pain, rejection, and grief. Her parents had died when she was young, leaving her to be raised by distant relatives who saw her as nothing more than a burden. She had bounced from home to home, never finding a place where she truly belonged. And now, she claimed, something darker had come into her life, something beyond her control. The shadows had come for her. "I don't know if it's real," she said, her eyes wet with tears. "But I can't fight it alone anymore." James listened intently, his mind drifting in a haze of compassion. It was what he was trained to do, what he had always done: help, listen, guide. But in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered, "Is this truly about salvation, or something else?" The storm raged outside, the thunder echoing through the heavens. The church, a place of peace, suddenly felt heavier, darker. Evelyn's voice, once weak and tremulous, grew steadier as she spoke, as though the weight of her past was drawing her closer to him, weaving an invisible thread between them. And as the night wore on, James found himself lost in the quiet intensity of her presence. The lines between his duty and his own growing, unwanted feelings began to blur. He knew what he should do. He knew what was right. But Evelyn's pain, her vulnerability, her need, it stirred something within him, something he hadn't realized had been there all along. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that had begun to stir in his heart. As they prayed together that night, Evelyn's hand brushed his. A fleeting touch, but enough to send a shock through him. The feeling was sudden, undeniable. Was it the storm? Was it the exhaustion of the day? Or was it something deeper, something far more dangerous? Father James Hunter, the man who had always stood firm in his faith, suddenly found himself at the edge of a precipice, teetering between the divine and the damning. The door to temptation had opened, and he had stepped through it, unaware of how far he was about to fall. Father James Hunter had always been a man of unwavering conviction. Raised in the small town of Briarwood by his mother, Margaret Hunter, a devout woman who had worked tirelessly for the church, James grew up in an environment where faith was both the foundation and the compass of life. From a young age, he was taught to serve, to sacrifice, and to put the needs of others above his own. His mother often said that James had a heart as pure as gold, and he took those words to heart. He spent years studying theology, preparing himself for a life dedicated to God and the congregation of Briarwood. Yet, as the years passed, something within him began to change. The early days of his priesthood, full of enthusiasm and a sense of duty, had slowly worn down. While his community adored him for his kindness, his patience, and his unwavering faith, James couldn't shake the gnawing feeling of isolation that had begun to take root. His life was filled with the rituals of the church, sermons, confessions, counseling, but each night, when he closed the church doors and returned to the empty quarters behind them, he felt a deep void. His vows, made in the name of God, had kept him from the love he longed for, but they had not filled the emptiness inside of him. He had never known what it was like to have a family of his own, to experience the simple joy of companionship. The love his mother had shown him, though constant and unyielding, was not the love of a partner. It was the love of a devoted parent, and despite its warmth, James felt it lacked the kind of intimacy and connection he had always secretly yearned for. As much as he tried to suppress these feelings, they were undeniable. The loneliness crept in slowly at first, just a fleeting thought in the middle of his duties. But it began to grow. He found himself retreating more and more into his own thoughts, distracted during prayers, his mind wandering to places it should never have gone. It was a constant struggle, one that filled him with guilt and shame, yet the ache inside him remained. Meanwhile, Evelyn's past was a tangled web of loss, neglect, and emotional scars. Raised by distant relatives after the death of her parents in a car accident when she was just a child, Evelyn had never known the warmth of a loving home. Her aunt, a cold and indifferent woman, saw her as little more than a burden, forcing her to grow up in a household where love was scarce, and affection was an afterthought. As a result, Evelyn learned early on to fend for herself, to mask her pain with a facade of strength. But deep down, she was a broken soul, a woman who had been discarded by the world. Evelyn's teenage years were marked by rebellion and confusion. She craved attention, the kind of attention that would make her feel seen, make her feel important. The more she sought it, the more she found herself caught in toxic relationships. Men who offered fleeting affection only to leave her when things got tough, or worse, men who manipulated her vulnerability. Her life became a series of broken promises and empty nights. She started to believe that perhaps there was something wrong with her, that maybe she wasn't deserving of love, or worse, that love was something that could only be used to her advantage. Her reputation in Briarwood was tainted long before she ever met James. Whispers of her troubled past followed her like a shadow, rumors of her involvement with dark forces and strange occurrences in her life. People avoided her, suspicious of the woman who always seemed to carry a hidden agenda. But Evelyn wasn't deterred. She had learned to live with the whispers. They didn't define her. What defined her was her drive to find the one thing that had eluded her all her life: true love, true acceptance, and perhaps, a chance at redemption. When Evelyn first saw Father James, she knew he was different. The rumors of his piety and goodness intrigued her, but it was his calm demeanor, the quiet strength in his eyes, that drew her in. For the first time, she felt like she had found someone who could see through the layers of darkness that had built up around her, someone who could offer her the salvation she desperately sought. But Evelyn's desires were far more complex than simply seeking guidance. She saw in James not only the opportunity for salvation, but also the chance to manipulate, to control, and perhaps to rewrite the narrative of her life. She had learned early on that people could be controlled if you knew what strings to pull. And James, despite his devout nature, was no different. Beneath his strong faith and rigid exterior, she could sense the vulnerability, the crack in the armor that would make him susceptible to her charm. It wasn't long before Evelyn began to subtly infiltrate his life. Her visits to the church, at first innocent, became more frequent, more intentional. She brought him meals, offering comfort with each visit. She listened to his burdens, shared her own, and in doing so, created an emotional bond between them. Each touch, each lingering glance, each carefully chosen word was part of a plan she had been formulating since the moment she laid eyes on him. She made him feel needed, made him believe that she was the lost soul in desperate need of saving. And as she did, she began to manipulate the emotions that he had worked so hard to suppress. For James, the line between duty and desire began to blur. He had spent years fighting against his own loneliness, his desire for companionship. But Evelyn, with her soft words and her quiet presence, was pushing him to the brink of a decision he hadn't been prepared to face. Was this a test of his faith? Or was this something far more dangerous, a temptation that could cost him everything? In the quiet stillness of his priestly quarters, as Evelyn's hand brushed against his, James could no longer deny it. The conflict inside him raged, pulling him in two different directions. But it was too late. Evelyn had already ensnared him. And now, the priest who had once been a beacon of faith for Briarwood was about to fall into the very darkness he had sworn to fight. It was on a stormy evening in late May that the world James had carefully constructed began to fracture. The wind howled through the trees outside Briarwood Community Church, and the air smelled of rain, cold and uninviting. Inside, Father James Hunter stood in his small, humble quarters, staring out of the window, lost in thought. The calm of the evening should have provided him with solace, but instead, the growing tension inside him gnawed at him like an unrelenting ache. The years of quiet devotion had brought him to a point of exhaustion. His work in the church, his duties to the community, the constant weight of being the spiritual leader of Briarwood, it all felt suffocating. But it was not just the responsibilities that weighed on him. It was the overwhelming loneliness, the absence of something deeper, something personal. His nights were spent in prayer, his days devoted to others, yet he could not shake the feeling that something was missing, something that, perhaps, he had no right to seek. As if on cue, a knock echoed through the door, sharp and insistent. James startled, his thoughts scattering. He had been expecting no one. When he opened the door, Evelyn Morris stood in the doorway once again, drenched from the rain. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, James felt a flicker of something he couldn't name. It wasn't just the storm outside that seemed to stir the air, it was something about her presence, urgent, desperate, as if she was drawn to him, needing him in a way that was both innocent and unsettling. "Father," she said, her voice trembling, but her gaze never wavered. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but I couldn't bear being alone tonight." James stepped aside without thinking, allowing her entry. He was accustomed to people seeking comfort in times of distress, but tonight felt different. There was a palpable heaviness in the room, a sense of inevitability. As she crossed the threshold, James felt a tightness in his chest. He could not explain it, but her presence unsettled him in a way he hadn't expected. Once inside, Evelyn didn't waste time. She quickly moved towards the small, well-worn chair by the fire, as though she had been there 1,000 times before. She sat down, her eyes not leaving his. James remained standing, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, trying to maintain some semblance of control. "I couldn't stay in my apartment tonight," Evelyn continued, her voice low and soft. "I've been hearing things, seeing things. The darkness feels like it's closing in on me, Father. I don't know where else to turn." James paused, his mind grappling with the situation. Evelyn's words were those of a woman clearly in pain, but there was something more in her eyes, something that told him this was no ordinary request for help. It felt calculated, as if she had planned this moment for a reason. Still, he reminded himself of his duty. She was a troubled soul, and it was his responsibility to guide her, to help her find peace. "I understand," he said, his voice steady, though his heart raced. "You're welcome here, Evelyn. Let's pray together. I'll help you find the peace you seek." She nodded, her lips curling into a small, knowing smile. As James knelt beside her, Evelyn reached for his hand, her fingers brushing against his. The simple contact sent a jolt of electricity through him. It wasn't just the warmth of her touch, it was something deeper, something far more dangerous. For a moment, their eyes met, James's gaze lingering on hers longer than he intended. There was an intensity in her eyes that he couldn't ignore. Something primal, something that stirred within him despite his best efforts to remain composed. He pulled his hand back slightly, but Evelyn wasn't finished. Her gaze never faltered, and she moved closer, as though drawn to him by an invisible force. "Father," she whispered, her voice softer now, more intimate. "You've been so kind to me. I've never known anyone like you. You make me feel safe. But sometimes the world feels so dark. I wonder if anyone could truly understand me, truly help me." James's chest tightened, the guilt clawing at him. This was not how it was supposed to be. He had taken an oath to serve, to remain pure in his devotion to the church and to his faith. Yet here he was, alone with this woman, her words stirring something in him that he had worked so hard to suppress. "I'm here to help you," James said, his voice thick with emotion, his grip on his own resolve slipping. "But you must trust in God, Evelyn. He is the light in the darkness. I will pray with you, and together, we will find a way through this." But Evelyn, with her soft, haunting gaze, shook her head. "I don't want just prayer, Father. I want more. I need more." Her hand reached out once more, this time placing itself lightly on his arm. Her touch lingered, a silent plea for him to understand. For the first time in his life, James was unsure whether his heart was following God's will, or if it was following the dangerous path that Evelyn had quietly set before him. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, as the storm continued to rage outside. James could feel the walls of his faith crumbling, piece by piece. He knew this moment could change everything, but he wasn't sure how to stop it, how to resist what Evelyn was offering. She had wormed her way into his soul, making him question everything he had ever believed. His pulse quickened, his breath shallow. The priest who had sworn to lead others into the light was now standing at the edge of a precipice, staring down into the very darkness he had sworn to banish. Evelyn's lips parted as if to speak, but it was James who broke the silence. "You must leave now," he said hoarsely, standing abruptly, as though shaking off an unseen weight. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were empty. He wanted to believe them, to push her away. But he could feel the pull of her presence, the magnetic force that had already begun to draw him into her orbit. "Please," Evelyn whispered, her voice soft but insistent. "I'm already lost, Father. And you're the only one who can save me." As she spoke, James felt himself slipping, further and further into the abyss. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and conflict for Father James Hunter. Evelyn's presence lingered like a shadow in every corner of his thoughts, her eyes, her touch, her words haunting him even in the quiet moments when he tried to retreat into his duties. Each time he thought he had regained control, she reappeared, her timing always impeccable, her intentions always clear, though hidden beneath the surface. She had been to his quarters every evening since that first stormy night, bringing him food, staying long enough to talk but never too long to seem intrusive. It was as if she had become a fixture in his life, weaving herself into his daily routines, making it difficult for him to distinguish between his duty as a priest and the forbidden feelings that now stirred within him. She never asked directly for more, never spoke the words that James feared, but everything she did was a silent demand, pulling him in deeper with every smile, every gentle gesture, every seemingly innocent touch. James tried to push her away, to keep the distance that his vows demanded, but Evelyn had a way of making him feel as though he was the one who needed her. She spoke of her childhood traumas, of the suffocating loneliness that had driven her to seek solace in dangerous relationships. She shared her fears of the unknown, her belief that something darker than just grief had clouded her soul. And with each word, each confession, James felt his resolve weakening. He had heard of the darkness that people like Evelyn carried, had read about it in his theological studies, spirits of despair, inner demons that took hold of the mind and soul. But he hadn't realized how easily a soul could be manipulated, how easily his own heart could be swayed by the subtle, persistent pull of Evelyn's charm. One evening, as James sat in his office preparing his sermon, Evelyn knocked on the door. Her entrance was familiar by now, but tonight there was something different about her, something more purposeful in her steps, a quiet confidence that made his stomach churn. "Father," she said softly, her voice dripping with sweetness as she sat across from him. "I've been thinking about you a lot. About how much you've done for me, how much you've sacrificed to help people like me. I don't think anyone has ever really understood me the way you do. You've given me hope when I didn't think I could find it again." James swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words press down on him. It was impossible to ignore the sincerity in her voice, the vulnerability she projected. She made him feel like the hero, the man who could save her, the one she turned to in her darkest hour. But the more she relied on him, the more he became entangled in her web. The line between compassion and desire was quickly blurring, and James knew it was only a matter of time before he lost himself entirely. "You don't have to thank me, Evelyn," James replied, his voice strained. "It's my duty to help you, to guide you toward healing. But you must also trust in God to give you the strength to overcome this. You can't rely on me alone." She smiled, a smile that seemed to reach deep into him, pulling him closer even as he tried to maintain distance. "I do trust in God, Father," she said, leaning in ever so slightly. "But I trust you too. You're the one who has been here for me when no one else would. You're the one who sees me, really sees me, in a way that no one else has." Her words were like honey, sweet and inviting, wrapping around his thoughts and making it harder to think clearly. She was right about one thing: James had been the one to offer her solace, the one to listen to her cries, the one who had welcomed her into the sanctuary of the church. But this wasn't just about saving her soul anymore. It was about something else. Something dangerous, something forbidden. As the days turned into weeks, Evelyn's visits became more frequent, more insistent. She arrived at all hours, sometimes with a meal, other times just to talk. Each time, she wore a soft smile, her eyes filled with a quiet intensity that made it impossible for James to look away. She no longer asked for his help in the same way. Instead, she began to show him gratitude in ways that made his heart race, subtle touches on his arm, lingering glances, her voice dropping to a low, almost intimate tone when they spoke. One evening, as the evening sun set and the golden light filtered through the church's stained glass windows, Evelyn came to James once again. But this time, she brought with her a bottle of wine. She had a gentle way about her that evening, one that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing. "I thought we could relax, Father," she said with a soft chuckle, pouring wine into 2 glasses. "You've been working so hard. You deserve a break." James hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. It was a simple offer, a gesture that could easily be seen as harmless. But there was something in her eyes, something that told him this wasn't just about wine. This wasn't just about relaxation. This was another step in the slow, deliberate unraveling of his will. "I don't know if this is a good idea, Evelyn," James began, his voice low, struggling to maintain some semblance of authority. "We shouldn't be alone like this. You deserve to be in a place where people can help you, not here, with me." But Evelyn was undeterred. She placed the glass in front of him, her fingers brushing his hand as she did. "You're the only one who can help me, Father. You're the only one I trust." The words hung in the air between them, thick with unspoken meaning. And as she raised her glass, her eyes never leaving his, James felt the pull once more, stronger than before, deeper than before. The glass trembled in his hand as he reached for it, his resolve crumbling. He took a sip, his mind clouded with the warmth of the wine and the lingering tension between them. In that moment, everything shifted. The walls he had built around his faith, his vows, his identity as a man of God, began to crack. And with each passing moment, Evelyn's hold on him tightened, until he was no longer sure where his duties as a priest ended and his desires as a man began. Evelyn Morris had begun to transform from a broken woman seeking salvation into something far more dangerous, someone who had learned to manipulate his every thought, his every weakness. And James, once a man of pure faith, was slipping farther into her trap with every breath he took. The air in Briarwood felt heavy with the unspoken tension that had settled over the town in the weeks since Evelyn had begun visiting Father James more frequently. The once harmonious atmosphere of the community was now clouded by whispers and side glances. What had begun as subtle gossip soon became open suspicion, and the once revered Father James found himself under a microscope, his every move scrutinized by the very people who had once relied on him for guidance. It was during a warm, sunlit afternoon in early June that the first cracks in the facade of his calm life appeared. As James stood at the pulpit delivering his sermon, the words felt hollow, as if the words of Scripture no longer held the same weight. His eyes shifted nervously from one parishioner to the next, their gazes now different, more watchful, less trusting. The small-town charm of Briarwood, where everyone knew everyone else's business, had begun to feel suffocating. James couldn't ignore the tension any longer. His thoughts, once consumed by the divine, now wandered back to Evelyn, the haunting gaze she had shared with him, the way her presence made his pulse race, the quiet moments they shared in the solitude of his quarters. What had begun as a simple act of compassion was now a full-blown internal struggle, one that threatened not only his vows but his standing in the community. It wasn't just his congregation that had started to take notice. His mother, Margaret, had always been the steady rock in his life. A woman who had raised him with unwavering devotion to the church, she was not one to be easily deceived. Margaret had always been proud of her son, the man he had become. But the changes in James had not gone unnoticed. Margaret had grown quiet, her eyes often clouded with concern when she looked at him. And on this particular day, after his sermon, it all came to a head. James had been walking toward the sacristy when his mother approached him, her steps deliberate, her expression unreadable. The small room was empty, save for the two of them, and the tension between mother and son was palpable. "James," Margaret began, her voice tight with unspoken worry. "I need to speak with you." He turned to face her, his heart heavy with the weight of the conversation he knew was coming. "Of course, Mother. What's troubling you?" Margaret's gaze softened for a moment, but there was no mistaking the seriousness in her eyes. "It's Evelyn, isn't it?" James froze. The mention of Evelyn's name sent a shiver down his spine. His mother had always been astute, aware of the smallest shifts in the town. She had heard the whispers, seen the concerned looks exchanged between the parishioners when Evelyn came to church, and it didn't take long for her to draw her own conclusions. "I don't know what you mean," James stammered, hoping his voice didn't betray him. "James, I've watched you," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've been different. There's something between you and that woman, and I can see it. The way you've been avoiding your duties, the way you've been distracted. She's not who she seems to be." James' heart sank. His mother had always been his moral compass, and to see the look of concern in her eyes made him feel like he was betraying everything he had been raised to be. But the truth was undeniable. Evelyn had wormed her way into his life, and in some twisted way, he had allowed it. "You don't understand," James began, his voice trembling with emotion. "She needs help, Mother. She's lost, and I'm the only one who can save her." Margaret's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening. "And what about yourself, James? What about your own soul? You've dedicated your life to God, but now I see you losing yourself. She's not the salvation you think she is. You're being manipulated, my son." The words stung more than James cared to admit. He wanted to argue, to defend Evelyn, but deep down, he knew his mother was right. He had allowed himself to become vulnerable, to step beyond the boundaries he had sworn to uphold. And it wasn't just his mother who had noticed the shift. The entire town was beginning to feel the impact. As he walked out of the church, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the town's cobbled streets. The tension was palpable. Parishioners exchanged uneasy glances as James passed by, their whispers barely masked by the rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. James knew they were talking about him, about his growing connection with Evelyn. The gossip had spread like wildfire, and soon, it would be impossible to ignore. That evening, Evelyn arrived at his quarters, as expected. But this time, there was something different in the air. Her smile was softer, more knowing, and as she stepped inside, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was falling further into her trap. She closed the door behind her, her eyes never leaving his. "I can feel the tension in the town, Father," she said, her voice sweet, yet laced with an unsettling edge. "They're watching you. They're judging you." James felt his breath catch in his throat. He had known the town's suspicions were growing, but to hear Evelyn speak of it so casually felt like the final straw. She wasn't just a woman in need of salvation, she was someone who was fully aware of the power she held over him, and she was using it to manipulate him further. "I've always known what they thought of me," James replied, his voice tight. "But I'm here to help you, Evelyn. Nothing else matters." Her lips curled into a smile, one that sent a chill down his spine. "You're wrong, Father. You've become a part of this story now. And the more you resist, the more you'll lose. The church, your family, your very soul. All of it is slipping through your fingers." The word struck James like a physical blow. She was right. Every day, the walls around him grew tighter. His duty to the church, his vow to God, had become suffocating. But with Evelyn, he found a release, an escape from the turmoil within him. She had become both his tormentor and his salvation. And yet, even as he faced the unraveling of everything he had known, part of him couldn't bring himself to stop. Because deep down, he knew that Evelyn had already won. She had taken root in his heart, and there was no turning back. It was in the sweltering heat of mid-July when Father James Hunter realized the true cost of his actions. The church, once his sanctuary, now felt like a prison, the walls closing in around him with every passing day. His every move was scrutinized by the people of Briarwood, whispers following him wherever he went. He could see it in their eyes, doubt, suspicion, and judgment. They had once adored him, trusted him to be their moral compass. But now, as the rumors surrounding his relationship with Evelyn grew louder, that trust began to crumble. The turning point came when the town's gossips reached the ears of his mother, Margaret. The once constant presence of support and guidance in his life now felt distant, almost foreign. Her visits to him had grown more infrequent, and when she did come, her eyes were filled with quiet despair. Margaret had always been able to read him like an open book, and it wasn't long before she saw through the facade James had built around his emotional turmoil. One afternoon, after yet another sermon that had felt more like a performance than a calling, Margaret approached him as he sat alone in the church office, the weight of the world on his shoulders. "James," she began, her voice quiet but resolute. I can't do this anymore. You're breaking my heart. He looked up at her, his gaze haunted. He could feel the pain in her words, but he had no answer. The situation had spiraled far beyond his control, and no matter how much he wanted to push Evelyn out of his life, he couldn't. She had become inextricably linked to his every thought, his every action. I'm not the man you raised, Mother, James said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't stop myself. I've tried, but I can't. Margaret's face crumpled with sorrow, but her voice held firm. This isn't you, James. This woman, Evelyn, she's using you. I've seen the way she looks at you, the way she manipulates you. You've forgotten your vows. You've forgotten your purpose. James clenched his fists, his chest tightening with guilt. I know, but I can't let her go. She's different. She needs me. No, Margaret cut in sharply. You need to remember who you are. You need to remember your duty to God, to this community, and to yourself. You're not helping her. You're enabling her destruction, and your own. James' heart ached as his mother's words struck him like a knife. He had always prided himself on being strong in his faith, but now, he felt weak, lost in a fog of his own making. He had fallen prey to temptation, to the allure of someone who had promised him something he had been too afraid to seek on his own, connection, intimacy, and the illusion of love. But he knew deep down, Evelyn wasn't the savior she appeared to be. She had only come into his life to break him, to use him for her own gain. As if on cue, Evelyn appeared in the doorway, her presence as commanding as it was unsettling. She smiled at James, a knowing smile, one that sent a chill down his spine. He had seen that look before, calm, calculated, and far too sure of herself. You know, Father, Evelyn said, her voice almost sing-song, I'm grateful for everything you've done for me. But I think it's time we took our relationship to the next level. James looked at her, his breath catching in his throat. He knew what she meant, what she was implying. But what terrified him more than the idea itself was the realization that he had come to this point, not because he had wanted it, but because he had allowed it to happen. Evelyn stepped closer, her fingers lightly brushing his arm, sending a wave of discomfort through him. I think it's time for you to prove how much you truly care, Father. I need your help with something, and I won't take no for an answer. The words hit James like a punch to the gut. Evelyn's demands had always been subtle, veiled in neediness and vulnerability. But now, as she stood before him, the mask had slipped. The manipulation was clear, and it was far worse than he had ever imagined. She wasn't just pulling at his heartstrings anymore, she was controlling him, bending him to her will. He felt trapped, cornered by his own desires, his own guilt. The vows he had taken, those sacred promises, were fading, slipping away like sand through his fingers. He had fought so hard to remain steadfast, to be a man of God. But in the end, it wasn't the devil outside of him that had brought him to this point, it was the one inside. I can't, James whispered, his voice shaking. I've taken vows. I'm a priest. I can't betray that, I can't betray my faith. Evelyn's smile faltered for a moment, and then she stepped back, crossing her arms. Her tone shifted, becoming cold, almost threatening. You already have, Father. You've betrayed everyone who's ever trusted you. And now, if you don't give me what I want, I'll expose everything. All of it. The town will know about us. Your mother, your congregation, they'll all know. And then, what will you have left? James' breath caught in his throat. He knew she meant it. She had the power to ruin him, to destroy the life he had built. The guilt, the shame, the fear of losing everything, it all came crashing down on him at once. He had reached the point of no return. The price of his weakness, of his lapse in judgment, was steep. And Evelyn knew it. She had played him from the beginning, using his kindness, his guilt, his loneliness, and now, she had him exactly where she wanted him. James had always believed that salvation came through faith, through service. But now, he realized that salvation was something far more elusive, far more dangerous. He wasn't just struggling with his vows. He was fighting for his very soul. And Evelyn was the one who held the key. Father James Hunter had always prided himself on his unwavering faith. He had spent his life studying scripture, guiding his congregation, and serving the community of Briarwood with devotion and care. But now, as the days passed in a blur of self-doubt and guilt, his once unshakable faith seemed like a distant memory. It had been replaced by an overwhelming weight of shame, a gnawing sensation that ate away at him every time he tried to focus on his duties. James had lost count of how many times he had tried to pray, to find solace in the words of the Bible. Yet, no matter how hard he tried, he could not quiet the storm within him. The quiet voice of conscience, once so steady and reliable, now screamed at him, accusing him of betrayal. Each night as he lay in his bed, he could feel the weight of the secret he carried pressing down on him. The images of Evelyn, of her words and her touch, haunted him, chasing away any sense of peace he had once known. The guilt gnawed at him like a beast that refused to let go. He had broken his vows, betrayed his sacred oath to God, and worse, he had betrayed himself. He had been the one to allow Evelyn to get so close, to let her manipulate him. He had known it was wrong from the very beginning, yet he had let himself fall deeper into the trap she had set for him. Now, as he walked the streets of Briarwood, he could feel the eyes of the townspeople on him, their whispers barely hidden behind closed doors. They had all begun to suspect the truth. And they were right. James tried to drown out the sound of their judgments, but it was impossible. The community he had once served with pride now felt like a distant, foreign place. His parishioners, the people who had once trusted him to guide them, now seemed like strangers. He could no longer face them. He avoided eye contact, kept his head down, and prayed that no one would approach him. But it was always the same. The heavy silence, the uncomfortable glances, the disapproving whispers. Even his mother, once his pillar of support, had become a source of torment. Margaret's words, sharp and filled with concern, echoed in his mind. She had warned him, told him he was on the wrong path. And she had been right. He had ignored her. And now, the consequences were far worse than he could have imagined. She had stopped coming to him, no longer visiting the church or offering her quiet advice. Her absence weighed heavily on his heart, reminding him that the woman who had given him life, who had shaped his faith, was now alienated from him, too. The shame he felt was suffocating. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Evelyn's face, her eyes filled with desire and manipulation. She had used him, twisted his emotions, and now, she held him captive. She had threatened to expose their secret, to destroy him if he didn't comply with her demands. And he had complied. What else could he do? She had become a force greater than his own will, a force that had broken him down piece by piece. One evening, after another restless night filled with dreams of failure and ruin, James stood in front of the church's altar, the one place where he had always felt close to God. The candles flickered softly in the dim light, casting long shadows across the pews. He had come here to pray, to seek redemption, to beg for forgiveness. But as he knelt before the altar, his thoughts were anything but holy. He had failed. He had fallen into temptation, and there was no turning back. He had allowed Evelyn to destroy everything he had built, his faith, his vows, his integrity, and the trust of those who had depended on him. The weight of his sins pressed down on him like a physical force, threatening to crush him under its weight. Tears welled in his eyes, his chest tightening with the realization that he had not only betrayed God but had also betrayed the people he loved. He had been the one to lead them, to show them the path to salvation. But now, he was the one who needed saving. His hands trembled as he placed them on the altar, but he couldn't find the words to pray. How could he ask for forgiveness when he had so blatantly disobeyed the very vows he had sworn to uphold? How could he ask for mercy when he had done nothing but betray the trust of the people who believed in him? James could feel the distance between himself and God widening, the chasm between them growing ever deeper. The more he tried to reach out, the more he felt as though God was slipping further away from him, beyond his grasp. He had no right to ask for forgiveness. He had no right to expect grace. And yet, there he was, praying, begging for something he didn't deserve. The pain in his chest intensified, the realization of what he had lost consuming him. It wasn't just the church, or his community, or even his vows that he had destroyed. It was himself. He had lost the man he once was, the man who had believed so firmly in the path he had chosen, the man who had dedicated his life to serving others, to being a beacon of hope. That man was gone, replaced by someone who had failed, someone who had given in to his darkest desires. James could feel the fragments of his soul shattering, one piece at a time. He had broken something far deeper than his vows. He had shattered his own sense of self. And in doing so, he had allowed Evelyn to take everything from him, the trust, the respect, and the peace he had once known. He had fallen from grace, and there was no redemption left. The cold emptiness that filled him was worse than any sin he had committed. It wasn't the shame, nor the guilt, that weighed most heavily on him. It was the realization that he had lost himself, that the very core of who he had been was gone. And there would be no getting it back. Father James Hunter's world had crumbled, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the heavy weight of his own guilt. The man who had once stood with unwavering confidence, guiding others with the light of his faith, was now a broken shell of himself. The once sacred halls of Briarwood Community Church now felt like a tomb, the air thick with the silence of his soul's disintegration. Every prayer, every sermon, every step he took felt like an echo of a life he no longer recognized. It was Evelyn who had torn everything apart, though James couldn't bring himself to hate her. She had been the catalyst, the spark that ignited a slow, inevitable downfall. But in his heart, he knew that it was not Evelyn who was solely to blame. It was his own weakness, his own failure to resist, that had led him here. She had merely exploited what he had already allowed to fester inside him, the loneliness, the desire for intimacy, the longing for something more than the life he had been living. The final confrontation came one evening in late summer, when the air was thick with the scent of dying leaves. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the church. James sat in his office, staring out the window, his thoughts heavy and burdened. He had not slept properly in days, his mind consumed with the torment of what he had done, what he had allowed to happen. The guilt had become all-consuming, suffocating him, robbing him of any sense of peace. And then, as if summoned by his very thoughts, Evelyn appeared in the doorway. Her presence was unmistakable, as it always was, familiar, intoxicating, and suffocating all at once. She stepped inside, her footsteps silent, yet the weight of her arrival was palpable. She smiled, but it was a smile that no longer held any warmth. It was calculated, like a predator toying with its prey. "Father," she said softly, her voice like silk. "I think it's time we talk about what's next." James didn't move. His eyes, bloodshot from sleepless nights and endless self-loathing, stared at her, but he felt no anger. He had no more fight left in him. She had won. He had known for some time that she would push him to this point, that she would demand the ultimate sacrifice from him. "I've already given you everything," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "What more do you want from me?" Evelyn's eyes darkened, and she stepped closer to him, her gaze never leaving his. She reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder, a touch that still held the power to send shivers down his spine. "I want you to choose, Father," she said, her words dripping with menace. "I want you to choose me, or everything you've ever known. Your faith, your vows, your life, your reputation. I know how much you care about it all. I know how much you've sacrificed. But now it's time to decide. Me, or everything else. James' heart pounded in his chest as her words cut through him like a knife. He knew what she was asking. She had been slowly chipping away at him for months, and now, she was offering him the final piece of the puzzle, his soul, his salvation, or his continued descent into darkness. Please, Evelyn, he begged, his voice breaking. I don't want this. I don't want to lose everything. I've already lost so much. Evelyn's smile widened, but it was a smile devoid of kindness. You already have, Father. You've already lost it all. You lost it the moment you let me into your life. The weight of her words settled into him like a stone. He had already given up everything. His faith, his vows, his integrity, everything that had once defined him was gone. And now, standing before him, was the last chance to save himself. But it came at a price. Evelyn stepped back, her gaze never leaving his. I'll give you one last chance, Father. Choose me, and I'll give you everything you've ever wanted. A life without guilt, without restraint. I'll give you the peace you seek. But if you choose them, if you choose your faith, your church, your vows, you'll lose everything. You'll never be able to walk away from this. You'll be exposed. The town will know. The church will reject you. You'll be nothing. Her words hung in the air, thick with finality. James felt as though the floor beneath him had dropped away. He could hear the distant sound of the church bells ringing in the background, their toll a reminder of the man he had once been. But those bells felt distant now, as if they were tolling for someone else. He stood up slowly, his legs shaky, his body heavy with exhaustion. His mind raced, but it was clouded with confusion, with fear. He thought of his mother, of his community, of the vows he had made, and of the God he had once loved. But above all, he thought of Evelyn, the woman who had ensnared him, the woman who had held him captive in a way he couldn't explain. James felt as though he were standing at the edge of a cliff, with only the abyss below him. One step forward, and he would fall. One step back, and he would be lost in the darkness forever. But there was no turning back now. He had already made his choice. I choose you, he whispered, his voice trembling. Evelyn's smile was triumphant, victorious. She stepped forward, her hand slipping into his, and for a brief moment, James felt the weight of everything he had lost. He had chosen her, had chosen the path that would lead to his undoing. But in that moment, it didn't matter. The craving for peace, for release from the turmoil inside him, had consumed him completely. As the darkness closed in, James knew that there was no salvation left for him. He had betrayed everything he had ever stood for, and now, there was nothing left but the consequences of his actions. Evelyn had won. And with her, James had lost everything. The town of Briarwood would never be the same again. The once tight community, founded on shared values and unwavering faith, was now fragmented, torn apart by the scandal that had rocked it to its very core. Father James Hunter's name, once synonymous with integrity and spiritual guidance, had become a symbol of betrayal, shame, and lost hope. The church that had been his home, his sanctuary, now felt like a place of exile, where the weight of his actions hung over him like a cloud, visible to everyone, impossible to escape. It wasn't just the church that had been damaged, it was the very fabric of the town itself. As news of James' downfall spread, so did the fractures within the community. Some saw him as a victim, manipulated and broken by a woman who had exploited his weaknesses for her own gain. Others, however, viewed him as complicit, as a man who had willingly given in to temptation and destroyed the very life he had vowed to protect. The division grew deep, like a scar on the face of the town that would never fully heal. Margaret, James' mother, had disappeared after his confession, the final, crushing words he had spoken to her echoing in his mind as he sat alone in the now quiet church. She had tried to warn him, tried to guide him back onto the right path. But her words had fallen on deaf ears, and now, like the rest of the town, she had withdrawn from him. James knew she would never forgive him, not for this. The thought of losing her, of losing everything he had once stood for, gnawed at him constantly. But it wasn't just his mother he had let down. It was his entire congregation, the people who had trusted him to be their spiritual guide, who had turned to him in times of need. In the days following his choice, James became a ghost in Briarwood. He walked the streets, a hollow version of the man he once was, avoiding the gaze of anyone who might see the shame on his face. The town no longer saw the priest who had served them, they saw a man who had chosen his desires over his duty, a man who had failed the very people who had put their faith in him. He could hear the whispers every time he passed by, feel the judgment that followed him like a dark cloud. He had become the embodiment of what happened when temptation and duty collided, and it was a lesson no one would ever forget. But as the months passed, the consequences of his actions grew clearer. Evelyn, who had once held so much power over him, had vanished. No longer did she stand in his quarters, casting her haunting gaze on him, making demands he could never meet. James never heard from her again, and while part of him felt relief at her disappearance, the other part of him knew he would never be free of her grip. She had taken everything from him, not just his reputation but his very sense of self. And now, as he wandered through his empty life, he realized she had left him with nothing but the wreckage of his choices. The town, however, had moved on. Briarwood would recover in its own way, though it would never forget what had happened. The church tried to rebuild, but it was difficult. The stain of scandal was not so easily erased. James, once so confident in his role as a man of faith, had been humbled in the most devastating way possible. For him, there was no redemption. He had lost his place in the world he had once known, and now, he was left to grapple with the eternal consequences of his actions. His heart ached with the knowledge that there was no going back. No matter how hard he prayed, no matter how many hours he spent in penance, he knew he would never be able to undo what had been done. His soul, once dedicated to the service of others, had been tainted by his own weakness. The lessons of this story were clear, but they were hard to swallow. Temptation, no matter how subtle, could lead even the most faithful astray. The choices we make, especially those made in the shadows of our desires, can have consequences far beyond what we ever imagined. And once we let our guard down, once we allow ourselves to stray from the path we've sworn to follow, the road back is never as easy as it seems. So, what do you think about this tragic story of temptation and betrayal? Do you believe that James could have found redemption if he had chosen differently? Could Evelyn have been stopped before she manipulated him so deeply? We want to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what you think about James' choices and the consequences of his actions. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories that explore the complexity of human nature, the dark side of desire, and the moral dilemmas we all face. Join us next time as we delve into more gripping, real-life tales.